All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I've gotten a response from most of you, but I want to clarify this is when you guys gave me your sport and the position that you want to do for your assignments, it's important, and this is my fault, I've got to tell you guys this, it's important that you let me know what level of play that you're programming for. And the only reason that that's important is because when you make up, when you're looking at a competitive calendar and you make up the seasons for in-season, out-of-season, post-season play, and you make up your assignment number 3, which is your year-long periodized plan, you have to know what the seasons are. So you have to know what you're playing for, playing when you're in, when you're out of season. And obviously, there's quite a few people who chose hockey. So hockey in high school and hockey in pros is 2 different things. The pros are still playing into June for a Stanley Cup championship, and high school is done by spring break. So there's a big difference in scheduling there in terms of like being able to program for an entire year. So make sure you let me know if you haven't already what level of play you're looking to do for your sport, and that's really meant just basically for for this class. It's meant for a schedule and a competitive calendar. Certainly, if we took it a step further and go above and beyond this class, you would actually probably train professional athletes differently than you would train high school kids, because the pros they're about as good as they're going to be physically, and you're just trying to keep them healthy. And you're talking about keeping a multi-million-dollar arm in baseball healthy, as opposed to a high school pitcher who's just trying to get into college. So there's 2 different things there, but that's way beyond the scope of this class. But at least from a calendar perspective, you should know what level you're at. So, all right, today is going to be chapter 4, endocrine response, resistance exercise. Hopefully this weekend as well, I will also put up a study guide for exam number 1, so you start looking at that. But to be honest with you, I think study guide is kind of silly, because all I'm doing is regurgitating what's on the slides. So if you're coming to class and if you're listening to the Zoom lectures and you're following along and you're learning about what we're talking about on these slides and looking through the book, then there's your study guide right there. But I'll post one anyway because some people like that. So so today we're going to talk about hormones and how they interact with the body due to external stimulus. And just double checking, Sarah, give me a thumbs up because I'm seeing you. You can see my slides. Is that correct? Perfect. Okay, just making sure. So while the endocrine system serves many purposes, our focus today is just directly on those that are interacting with muscles and then the effects of that, and obviously how training and recovery and programming can be affected by, or hormones can be affected by training, recovery, and programming. So we'll describe some of the hormonal responses to exercise, resistance exercise, the role of anabolic hormones. We'll talk about developing training programs to demonstrate understanding of human endocrine response. Now, obviously, we need to dive into a little bit about what hormones are and how they work, so you can understand a little bit better. So let's start off with the 3 different types of hormones that there are. And basically what you're breaking them down into is either anabolic, catabolic, and then there are some that are permissive, but really the focus is going to be anabolic and catabolic. And so an anabolic hormone is one that builds. So, and then a catabolic hormone is one that breaks down. And then a permissive hormone is one that allows other hormones to do their job, basically is what it comes down to. So it's important that we understand what happens to an anabolic hormone when we prescribe certain exercises. What happens to that response if we decide that we want to do a back squat versus a leg curl or a bicep curl or something along those lines. First thing we need to start off with here and talking about is general adaptation syndrome. Okay, and this was basically founded by Hans Selye, although he didn't even understand that he unknowingly provided the theoretical basis for periodization. So his work was on the work of the adrenal gland and the role of stress hormones and how the body and hormones adapt to stress, distress, and illness. And later on, scientists found that there's very strong similarities to his stress patterns that he found in his work and training responses of athletes. Because when you apply a training response to an athlete, you're hoping to apply a stress. You want to apply a stress because you want them to adapt to that stress and get better. So they found some very similar things to that, and then that's kind of where periodization comes from, is from that concept. As we know, an increase in resistance to a stress is called an adaptation. And when that stress is exercise, it's called a training adaptation. So you, as a strength conditioning coach, are trying to get training adaptations, okay? You want to improve a certain quality within an athlete. You want to improve max strength. You're looking to get a training adaptation by applying a stress to get the goal you want. You want to make somebody more explosive, more powerful. You apply the stress in order to make sure that that happens. So the key to training, excuse me, the key to training adaptation is to remove the stress and the stimulus, recover from that stress, and then reapply the stress with greater dosage. And basically what we're talking about here in exercise is progressive overload, okay? That's the most important concept when it comes to designing strength training programs, is to provide progressive overload. And there's lots of different ways to do that. We'll get into some of those ways today, but we'll get into a lot of the ways to provide progressive overload when we start talking about programming. Now, this is a good table or a graph, if you will, of what progressive overload and general adaptation syndrome are. So the dotted line is kind of like your baseline, okay? With this axis over here being work capacity and this axis over here being time. So our work capacity is pretty low right now, okay? We apply a stress, which is exercise. Our body has a negative reaction, if you will, to that stress. We recover from it, and this is our recovery as soon as the stress is applied till the next time the stress is applied. We get, our body adapts, gets that training adaptation, and all of a sudden our new work capacity is now here. We apply a stress, we drop down, we recover, we come back up, we have a new work capacity, okay? And we just keep working our way down this direction. This again is progressive overload, okay? So if I keep applying the same stress all the time, then I'm never going to get above that line. If I apply more stress here, then I'm going to start adapting and getting better. Let me give you a really, really simple example, okay? I ask you to run 1 mile right here, okay? You're going to adapt to that stress. If I tell you again after you recover to run another 1 mile, and then I ask you again after you recover to run another 1 mile, and we keep repeating that process, we become adapted to that 1 mile and we no longer gain. So if I want you to gain, what should I prescribe here? 2 miles, just hypothetically. Here, 3 miles, 6 miles, 9 miles, whatever your goal is, right? Your goal is to run a half marathon, you want to try and get to that position. Now, this is very, very simple concept here. This goes into much more detail. We're talking about how do we get somebody to go from never running at all to running a half a marathon within 6 weeks. And there's some times you need to rest and go back up and back down, but basically this is what we're talking about here. Okay, so exercise selection now comes into play. So exercise selection is periodization, okay? So what exercises I choose will determine how many motor units are recruited, and therefore, the more motor units recruited, the greater the stress. The greater the stress, the greater the adaptation. For example, if I choose 3 sets of 10 at 70% of my 1 rep max on a back squat, which is going to recruit a lot of motor units because it's a multi-joint exercise, versus 3 sets of 10 on bicep curl, which one of those is going to create a greater stress and therefore greater adaptation? Okay, because I'm using more motor units, more muscles, this back squat is going to be causing more stress and more adaptation. Okay. The other thing that you're going to see a lot today, we're going to talk about a lot today, is the degree of hormonal response is directly related to the exercise volume and to the exercise intensity. So we're going to go over that a lot. The more volume and the more intensity, the greater the hormonal response. Okay, so if we sit here and we do 4 sets of 3 all day long, or I do 6 sets of 6, obviously these are percentage dependent, I'm going to get a much more bigger hormonal response out of this 36 reps than I will out of this 12. Okay, so we're going to see how intensity and volume relate with each other today a lot. All right, let's start diving into the hormones here a little bit. So anabolic hormones, as we said, they build, so they permit tissue building. Some of the anabolic hormones are insulin-like growth factor, better known as IGF, testosterone, and growth hormone. Some of the catabolic hormones that are degrading cell proteins and are tearing down, or catabolic, if you will, are cortisol and progesterone. Thyroid hormones act as permissive hormones. I don't have those on here, but those allow other actions of other hormones in order to take place. The roles of receptors in hormonal change. So this is in your book, it's a lock and key theory. A given hormone here will react with a specific receptor here. Okay? So that is how a hormone will enter into the cell. Now, cross-reactivity is one of our key terms here, is where a receptor partially interacts with a hormone. And then alloristic binding sites is where a substance other than a hormone can enhance or reduce the cellular response of a primary hormone. Let me break down this lock and key theory, this figure a little bit. Up in number 1, this area right in here is your blood circulation. Okay. Number 2 is your cellular wall. And then the third section down in here is inside of the cell. Okay, so in the blood system is where this testosterone and where this cortisol is flying around. And this is the specific receptor for that cortisol, and this is a specific receptor for that testosterone. And when that receptor receives that hormone, then they can release this into the cell to make things happen. The inability of a hormone to interact with its receptor is called down regulation. Okay. Sometimes when there is an overstimulation of a hormone, a lot of it, receptors can become less responsive, which means they're preventing further action. And when this happens, this is what is called down regulation. So that receptor is not as responsive to that hormone as it used to be. Receptors do have the ability to increase and decrease their binding sensitivity and their number of receptors. So exercise training can affect testosterone, for example, by increasing the number of receptors, not necessarily their sensitivity. So we're talking about specifically about testosterone. We can increase the number of receptors here, the purple. let's get into some categories of hormones here. So steroid hormones, they are fat soluble. They can passively diffuse across the cell membrane, so they don't need a receptor. So they go right through the target wall. And then their outcome depends on what is needed, and that's what everything over here on the right-hand side is. So they go through the target cell, and they could be metabolic effect, like protein synthesis, or they could be a physiological outcome associated maybe with sexual maturation. And it just depends on what the target outcome is. Some examples of some steroid hormone interactions are testosterone and cortisol. And as we know, one is anabolic and one is catabolic. Polypeptide hormones, they are made up of chains of amino acids. Example here is growth hormone and insulin. They are not fat soluble, so they need a receptor to cross the cell membrane. Okay, and it does take a secondary messenger to activate it within the cell. Final category of hormones here, amine hormone interactions, synthesized from amino acid tyrosine. We're basically talking about norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. Okay. Some of the things that will happen with these hormones are an increase in cardiac output, increase in glycogen breakdown, and an increase in fat metabolism. So a lot of people will look at trying to get some supplement-wise in norepinephrine for this purpose of reducing fat or using fat as a fuel. But the problem that people get themselves into and why norepinephrine, epinephrine are illegal, especially in the professional and college realm, is because of they can run themselves into trouble with increased cardiac output and end up into heart issues. All right, let's talk a little bit now about how heavy resistance training exercise can affect hormones. So key concept here is that the endocrine system is sensitive to the needs of activated muscle. So the type of exercise protocol will determine the system's involvement. And that goes back to what we talked about by your exercise selection. Hormones are secreted before as an anticipatory response. Hey, I'm getting ready to go out on a big run, a big ride, a big lift. And we start secreting hormones even before that point in time because our body knows we're getting ready to go. Hormones are secreted during and after resistance exercise bout due to the stress, the physiological stress of the resistance exercise. This post-workout secretion is really important for recovery and muscle remodeling. Okay, so we want those hormones to be circulating around the blood, and we want that little bit of inflammation to happen so that we can help with recovery, get those hormones that help recovery and muscle rebuilding. This is why it's often frowned upon to do cold tubbing after a lift. Okay, so some people like to cold tub to reduce inflammation, to flush out the system and flush out the muscles and get the blood flowing. But the problem is when you do that, when you flush out the blood, you're also flushing out all the hormonal responses that we want. So the more we can delay the cold tub after a lift, the better. Now, cold tubbing is fine after certain things. What I'm telling you is that if I go out for a long run, maybe cold tubbing is a good alternative for me right after, and I get help that. If I just got done with a heavy lower body exercise and I want to get that hormonal response and that strength response and that hypertrophy response, cold tubbing is not something that I want to do. As few as 1 or 2 heavy resistance exercise sessions can increase the number of androgen receptors in the muscle. So we talked about how we can get more response by either increasing the sensitivity of or increasing more receptors. And here, this is what we're talking about, where we can increase the number of receptors in a muscle. So key point here, the specific force produced in an activated fiber stimulates the receptor and the membrane sensitivities to anabolic factors, which include hormones, which leads to muscle growth and strength changes. You do not get the muscle growth or the strength changes unless you produce enough force. So when I talk to you about how many times we're going to talk about how the number of sets and the amount of weight that you move directly affects what muscle growth and changes you'll see, this is what I'm talking about. If you don't have enough force, you don't have enough stress, you're not going to have the adaptation that you want. So that heavy external load causes me to recruit more large muscle fibers and more activation of high threshold motor units than any other exercise will. That triggers more hormonal receptors to turn on. This is why periodization, choosing when you're gonna try to go heavy and hard, what exercises you're gonna choose from a programming standpoint, all play a key role in how much muscle growth you'll see and how much strength changes you're gonna have. If the stress is too great, you are going to get catabolic actions in the muscle that will exceed the anabolic actions due to downregulation or inability of anabolic hormones to bind. So I'm going to take you back a couple slides. So bear with me. I don't want to make you sick as I roll through this, but think about this. If the stress is too great, then I'm going to get more catabolic hormones than anabolic hormones floating around. And then therefore I got downregulation or the inability of the anabolic hormones to bind. So let me go back to this slide right here. If my stress on my exercise is too great, and these are my catabolic hormones, and these are my anabolic hormones, we're talking about testosterone and cortisone, I'm going to have too much of the circles floating around my blood system for the testosterone or the anabolic to hook on. This is what we're talking about there, okay? Where am I? There we go. So the magnitude of the hormonal response depends on the amount of tissue that is stimulated, the amount of tissue that's being remodeled, and the amount of tissue repair required based on the stress. If you provide too much stress, that is an error in exercise prescription, okay? Too much stress will break down muscle, and then therefore that muscle will enter the bloodstream. A protein called myoglobin is released and is going to handle that muscle that's in your bloodstream to try and break it down and try and filter it out. But where it's being filtered is your kidneys, because your blood is your kidney filter. This can cause failure in your kidneys. Have you guys ever heard of rhabdomyolysis? Okay, rhabdomyolysis is when your kidneys fail because they cannot handle the amount of muscle tissue that is being filtered through them because the exercise that you prescribed was too great and the stress of breaking down the muscle was too much. So this is where rhabdomyolysis or rhabdo is where strength and conditioning coaches can get themselves in trouble. So if you are a detrained athlete and you haven't done much training, and I prescribe an exercise program that is way too stressful for you, physically can't handle it, and I'm going to tear down a lot of muscle, that broken down muscle is going to go into your blood system. When it goes into your blood system, it gets broken down, but it has to go through your kidneys to filter. Your kidneys can't handle it, they fail, and you die. Or your kidneys fail. And there are athletes who have died from rhabdomyolysis. Okay. Now I don't want to pick on any one entity, because there are college strength coaches that get themselves in trouble with rhabdomyolysis. But one example that may fit better in your world, or you guys that you may know of, is when CrossFit has a exercise program or a routine that they do, and people haven't done it before. And I'll give you one, it's called the Murph. And the Murph happens on Memorial Day, typically. It's like a tradition that you do the Murph on Memorial Day. And the problem is the Murph is pretty hard to do. And people who do it may not be used to it. And all of a sudden they get in, they want to do the Murph. But the problem is they haven't been training very hard, or they haven't been training at all. And they're doing the Murph with their friend. And then they get a lot of muscle breakdown because they're competing with everybody else. They're trying to maintain what everybody else is doing, and then they start getting themselves into rhabdomyolysis issues. Okay, so this is where we need to make sure that we do not, as strength coaches, provide too much stress. And again, the key term here is to provide progressive overload, right? I provide this stress here, you handle it. I give you a little bit more stress, you handle it because you adapt to it. I give you a little bit more stress, you handle it, and you adapt to it. That's why knowing how much stress you're applying is really, really important. Otherwise, you could lose your license and lose your job because of rhabdomyolysis. Mechanisms of hormonal interactions are going to depend on several factors, such as blood concentration of hormones and their probability of interacting with the receptors, genetic factors, where muscle cells have reached a max, for example, they plateaued. So a muscle that has reached its maximum size may not be sensitive to the hormonal signals. So down regulation could happen because my muscle has reached a pretty big size, and so I'm not as receptive to that testosterone as I once was. And that's where, again, that athlete needs to try to enhance their stress. Receptors can become less sensitive to a hormone when the resting hormone levels are chronically high. You see these in diseases like type 2 diabetes. But whatever the factors are, they may be, but whatever those factors that may be signaling is influenced by neurofactors that are consistent with communication to make adaptation, hopefully improve that muscle size. Okay. So even though you have high concentration and in the blood system, it doesn't necessarily indicate the status of the receptor. Now we can assume that a higher concentration is better, but that's not always the case. So peripheral concentrations of hormone in the blood do not indicate the status of various receptor populations. It is typically assumed, however, that a larger increase in hormonal concentration flowing through the blood and increase in higher probability for interaction with receptors. So basically what we're talking about here is that the more testosterone that I have flowing through my blood system, the more chance I have of that testosterone interacting with the receptor. Now, there are companies, supplement companies out there that make a lot of money off of this idea, right? I'm gonna sell you that T-boost, right? That testosterone booster. I'm gonna put more testosterone in your blood system so that you got more flowing around, so it interacts with more receptors. This is where companies like GNC make a lot of money off of you who hope that happens. Now you can get a lot more blood, you can get a lot more testosterone flowing through your blood, but really it also depends on the receptor's ability to take it in. Physiological mechanisms that contribute to changes in that, how much peripheral blood concentration hormones there are, your circadian pattern. How many people know what circadian pattern is? Basically, it's your sleep, right? If you one night go to bed at midnight, the next night you go to bed at 8 p.m., the next night after that you go to bed at 4 in the morning, next night after that you don't sleep at all, your circadian pattern is really, for lack of a better term, messed up. And then that can affect how much peripheral blood concentration there is. This is why in my job, one of the things that we do is that we monitor sleep patterns of our athletes so that we know how many hours of sleep they're getting in, what was their quality of their sleep, and when did they go to bed and when did they get up. And the more consistent that their bedtime and wake times are, the better their circadian pattern is, the better their peripheral blood concentrations are going to be. Some other factors here that affect peripheral blood concentrations would be fluid volume shifts. We're talking about exercises tendency to push fluid from blood to cell and back. We're talking about tissue clearance rates. So how much time is the hormone spent in the tissue itself before it's cleared back out again? And what I was talking about there, you can relate back to that cold tub. Okay, if I want to clear out those tissue quick, then I go cold tub. If I want to leave it in there for a while, then I want to stay out of the cold tub. How much venous pooling and how much the hormone interacts with the binding proteins. So these are all going to affect how much peripheral blood concentrations there are. So a key point here, hormone response are tightly linked to the characteristics of the resistance exercise protocol. And I think we've said that enough times today to get that point across. Think back to my back squat example versus bicep curl. Greater hormonal response coming from this exercise here, from the one that I picked. Some adaptations in the endocrine system from resistance exercise. The amount of synthesis and storage of hormones. Okay. The time needed to clear hormones through the liver and other tissues. How many receptors? Not only how sensitive they are, but how many receptors are in the tissue. Changes in the contents of the secretory cells in the gland, and how much muscle protein the cell nucleus produces. So specifically, when we are training our muscles, we're also training and adapting our endocrine system at the exact same time. Keep in mind that the overall goal of your endocrine system is to keep things homeostasis, keep it back to normal. So when we provide a stress, we're taking our body out of its normal system, and our endocrine system wants to bring it back to normal. That's where it wants to stay. Okay, so resistance training then plays a role, as well as other changes to try and increase and decrease hormonal concentrations, because we're trying to, as a resistance training happens, we're trying to imply stress and get us out of that nice steady hormonal state. Let's start diving into some of these specific hormones. So first anabolic hormone we'll talk about is testosterone. primary androgen that interacts with muscle tissue. Testosterone's key is anabolic function is to bind its receptor. Let's start this over. Testosterone's key to anabolic function is the binding of its receptor more than its circulatory concentration. So think about what I just said right there. Its key to anabolic function is binding to the receptor more than its circulating concentration. So I can sit here and I can sell you the T-Boost supplement all day long to increase circular concentration, but it depends on your body's ability to have binding receptors more than anything else. Testosterone can promote growth hormone release. And that can influence protein synthesis in the muscle. So in this case, growth hormone is a permissive hormone for muscle growth. Testosterone can also impact force production by influencing the neural system and the muscle intervention. So more recruitment equals more force production. So testosterone exercise variables that can increase our concentrations. Again, we talked about this before, large muscle group exercises like deadlift and squat. And when we talk about large muscle groups, we're also talking about multi-joint. So there's two ways of thinking about it. My quad muscle is bigger than my bicep muscle. Okay. And if I'm doing deadlift and squat, bench press, I'm doing multi-joint exercises. Heavy resistance. So we need to have enough stimulus from enough heavy resistance to provide that stress. Moderate to high volumes of exercise. Okay. Short rest intervals. And then the more experience you have with resistance training, typically the greater the concentration of testosterone will be. Okay. So this is an important slide when we're talking about exercise prescription and what kind of things we want to get done. Do we want to apply a big stress and get a lot of testosterone concentration in the system? Then we want to prescribe squats, deadlifts, bench press, multi-joint exercises. We want the stress to be high. So we don't want to sit here and prescribe 50% of their max. That stress isn't high enough. Okay. We want to be 75, 85, 90% of their max. Moderate to high volume. So if you prescribe 75%, you got to be able to complete the volume that's prescribed for it. And I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. Okay. So if I say that you're going to do 75% of your max, but you're only going to do it for 2 reps, there's not enough volume there to make any change. If I tell you you can do 75% for 8 reps, now there's enough volume at that percentage to make enough stress to make a change. On this note too, there's also some argument about in terms of times of day for training, where some people will say that testosterone is at its highest in the morning. And as it goes throughout the day, it drops off. And so some people make the argument that it's better to train in the morning than the evening because the testosterone concentrations are higher. But really the larger impact has to do with prescription more than the time of day in training. So key point here, just to make sure we know we're talking about large muscle group exercises using adequate volume of total work result in acute increased testosterone concentration in men. So free testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin, free testosterone accounts for a very small amount of total testosterone that's flowing. Thus, higher total testosterone concentration allows for more free testosterone. Heavy resistance exercise can increase this free testosterone in men and women, although the increase is much smaller for women. Now, I want to make a point here, because if you're reading your book, in your book it says an example of that is 6 sets of 10 repetitions at 80% of a 1 rep max. Technically, that is incorrect. Okay. So if you want to prescribe 10 reps, and this is a class that's down the line, the most percentage, the most weight you can do for 10 reps is 73% of your max. So if I gave you 80% of your max and told you to do 10 reps at it, you couldn't do that. It's physically impossible. In the book, it says to do 6 sets of 10. Holy shnikes. You want to talk about rhabdomyolysis, I'll give it to you with that example right there. Okay, so I just want to make that point, because that book is a book, the example they gave here of what heavy resistance exercise is, and we're talking about free testosterone flowing, that's way too heavy. Okay, so I just want to make sure there's no confusion there. Young men will have more free testosterone than older men will. This is why young men will be able to put on muscle much easier than older men will. Okay. Responses in women. So women have about 15 to 20-fold lower concentrations of testosterone than men do. Now, this can vary substantially between individual women, as some women will increase higher concentrations of adrenal androgens. This is why you find some women to be hard gainers of muscle mass, and some women can gain muscle quite easily. But in general, women have a lower concentration of testosterone than men do. A couple slides here coming up to kind of show this example, and I'm gonna try and make the slides as simple as I possibly can, because the first time I saw them, I was kind of confused looking at them. But again, the example they're going to give in the book here is 6 sets of squats at 80% of 1 rep max with, and we're talking about rest time in between sets is important here, 2 minutes of rest between sets. And slide number A, they're looking at total testosterone, and then in B, they're looking at the free testosterone response. So we're talking about here, total testosterone flowing around. This is pre-exercise. This is immediately post-exercise. This is 5 minutes after, 15 minutes after, 30 minutes after. The men are up top, women are on the bottom. So right away we can see how much total testosterone the women have flowing, and how much the men have before you even start, and how much resistance training can have effect on how much is in the flowing through the blood system, and how that starts to drop off as the exercise ceases. And then in B here, we're talking about, in A, we're talking about total testosterone, and now we're talking about free. Same concept of pre, mid-workout, post-workout, 5, 15, 30, 70 minutes after workout, how those changes are different between men and women. And again, you're looking at acute responses here, not long-term. Okay. Primary anabolic hormones, testosterone, training adaptations, resistance exercise, and training increase muscle androgen receptor binding, which increases the use of testosterone. Ingesting protein and carbs before workout can increase the uptake of skeletal muscle engine content. I apologize for this arrow. I swear, every time I put this in a PDF, it turns everything around, but this arrow is supposed to be going this way. And nutrient timing and proper ratios are really important. So we're going to get into a chapter on nutrition here later on, but this is where we want to make sure that 30 to 60 minutes post-exercise, we want to get our good ratio of carbohydrate protein in us so that we can help with the adaptations from the hormonal response. Growth hormone. Studies have shown that there's a positive correlation to growth hormone response and muscle fiber hypertrophy after 20 weeks of training. So as our muscles get larger, so does the growth hormone response. Growth hormone is important for normal development of a child and appears to play a vital role in adapting to the stress of resistance training. Here are some of the physiological roles that you will see in growth hormone family. So you've got decreases in glucose utilization, an increase in protein synthesis and amino acid transport, increase in collagen synthesis. So we're making those joints stronger, the tendons and ligaments stronger, stimulating cartilage growth, enhanced immune cell function, and increased fat breakdown. So key point here, growth hormone release is affected by the type of resistance training protocol used. Again, we've talked about that a couple of times. The type of resistance training protocol used, including the duration of the rest period. Shorter the rest period, type workouts result in a greater concentration compared to longer rest protocols with similar total work. However, it's not clear how the various molecular forms or types of growth hormone are affected by rest period duration. So if I say we are going to do 5 sets of 10 on our exercises today, but I'm going to give you 60 seconds of rest, or I'm going to give you 3 minutes of rest, the response you're going to get is going to be different depending on which exercise protocol you choose. Growth hormone response in women. Motor concentrations and hormone response to exercise vary with the menstrual phase. The mechanisms of this aren't entirely clear. What they do know is that the cycles the women go through will reduce concentration of testosterone as well as other hormones within the body. At the highest level of athletics, and I'm talking about like Olympic level or pro to a certain degree, physiologists and strength coaches will periodize their training program around the female cycle, knowing that these things are going to happen. Growth hormone. Training adaptations. It appears that growth hormone concentrations need to be measured over long time periods, 2 to 24-hour time period, to show whether changes occur in resistance training. So you may not see an acute reaction, maybe a little more long-term. Very little work has been done to study growth hormone and resistance training, but some studies suggest that very little change is due to that training. Training adaptations of insulin-like growth hormone factor. The liver secretes insulin growth hormone factor after growth hormone stimulates the liver to synthesize it. It takes about 8 to 24 hours for it to be produced and released to the liver. Fat cells contain high concentrations of insulin-like growth factor, while skeletal muscle has very little. Adrenal hormones, cortisol. We're talking about catabolic here now. Exerts its major catabolic effect by stimulating the conversion of amino acids to carbohydrates, increasing the level of enzymes that break down proteins. That's the catabolic piece to this. It inhibits protein synthesis. If it's inhibiting protein synthesis, then it cannot make protein, it cannot make muscle. It has a greater catabolic effect on type 2 muscle fibers than it does on type 1. Something to keep in mind when you're talking about your athlete and what type muscle fiber type they are. Now, cortisol does a few other things as well, like it's good for metabolism, it's good for immune responses, it helps the body respond to stress. So it's not always bad, but when we're talking about muscle building, it can be. So if you increase the stress of the body, let's say through maybe like a lack of sleep, you increase your cortisol levels, which can have a catabolic negative effect on your ability to increase muscle mass, to get stronger, to get more powerful. Resistance exercise responses. So respond to resistance training protocols that create dramatic stimulus in anaerobic metabolism. The increased cortisol may not have a negative effect on men after a period of training to which the body is adapted. So the adaptation will disinhibit cortisol at the level of the testes, thereby maintaining testosterone's primary influence on nuclear receptors. So cortisol will increase with the resistance training, but when the rest periods are short and the total volume of the work is high. So again, if we go back to that example of providing, where to go right here, I'm going to get a greater cortisol response out of the 60 seconds of rest because the rest is so short compared to here. So it's like it's a kind of a combination of both. I want to get growth hormone release, but I don't want to increase my cortisol too much and get too much breakdown. Key point, resistance exercise protocols that use high volume, large muscle mass groups, and short rest periods result in increased cortisol values. Though chronic high concentration of cortisol may have adverse catabolic effects, the acute increases still contribute to remodeling muscle tissue and maintenance of blood glucose. So when we apply that stress of 5 sets of 10 with 60 seconds of rest, the effect is acute and can help with remodeling of muscle tissue. But if we continue to do this stress over and over and over again, then we've got a chronic cortisol release, and that's where the catabolic issues come into play. All right, a couple more slides here. Some more adrenal hormones, catecholamines. We're specifically talking about epinephrine, norepinephrine, and your dopamine. And their roles, they increase force production via central mechanism, increasing metabolic enzyme activity, increasing muscle contraction rate, increasing blood pressure, increasing the energy availability, increasing muscle blood flow via vasodilation. And they can augment secretion rates of other hormones such as testosterone. So like most hormones, if these will increase in release due to a fight or flight response that resistance training often provides. So studies have shown that men who have a higher catecholamine release prior to and during resistance training exercise maintained a better force output than those that did not. So this is where, as we start to get into maybe the psychology of strength training, where arousal is important. So if we can increase arousal to that strength training, then we're going to increase our release of these hormones that can have positive effects on force output and all the things we want to get out of that strength training. Training adaptations, catecholamines, heavy resistance training has been shown to increase the ability of the athlete to secrete greater amounts during maximal exercise. So we're increasing, if we're secreting greater amounts, we're increasing the blood concentration. Because epinephrine is involved in the metabolic control, force production, and the response mechanism of other hormones, stimulation of catecholamines is probably one of the first endocrine mechanisms to occur in response to resistance exercise. It's also important here to use the term adrenal exhaustion, and that can occur if the stress is too high for too long. And we constantly are emitting these hormones, then the release of catecholamines will go down. Last slide here, make sure that you look closely at the blue box on page 85 in your book, and it explains how the endocrine system can be manipulated with resistance training exercise, probably better than I can in this class, but more importantly, it explains it a different way, which I think is important. So make sure that you guys take a look at page 85 and that blue box, and it kind of is a good summary of everything that we talked about today with how the endocrine system can be manipulated with resistance training. So the key points here today, you can affect the endocrine system and use it to your advantage by working on the volume of exercise you prescribe, what intensity that exercise is, either by percentage of 1 RM from resistance training, or by how fast and explosive maybe you do something, or how long you do something. If I run for 5 miles, it's much more intense than I run for 1. If I try and move that weight fast, it may be more intense than if I move it slowly. And then also can be affected by the rest intervals that you prescribe. How much work are you prescribing and how much rest are you prescribing? And the balance of those two can affect the hormone response. So that is the key to hormonal response and any kind of, it says resistance training, but any kind of training that you guys do. Okay? If you got any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and let me know. If Madeline, Jacob, Jared, if he's on here, Elizabeth, if you're on here, Shane, and Grace, if you could stay on and unmute yourself and just kind of let me know what you're going to do for your sport, your position, and your level of play, that would be awesome. Guys, thanks for your time. Have a great day. We'll see you on Tuesday.